silent myself, right? I'll silence myself and you can take over, right? Okay.
Thank you, Amrita. With your permission, I'm going to share my screen.
Yeah. Please, go ahead.
Is it visible?
Yes, it's visible.
Thank you. Good afternoon to all. My today's topic of discussion is Raja Rao's Forward to Kantapura. Before moving on to the discussion, I'd like to briefly introduce the author, who is Raja Rao. He was born on 8th November 1908 in Hassan, Mysore. He was an Indian writer of English novels and stories. His works were deeply rooted in metaphysics. Now, metaphysics is something that deals with the reality.
Before going into details on the presentation itself, I'd like to introduce the author himself, Raja Rao.
He was in France, miles away from India.
Introduce the author himself.
When he wrote his first novel, Kantapura, 1938. Rao was awarded with Sahitya Akademi Award in 1964 and Padma Bhushan in 1969. He was a master of 3 languages, which are Kannada, French, and English. He participated in the Quit India movement of 1942. Rao was a professor of philosophy at the University of Texas at Austin. He died of heart failure on 8 July 2006 at his home in Austin at the age of 97. Now moving on to the next slide, I have tried to sum up the core of Kantapura. So this is the first novel of Raja Rao and in many ways his most perfect and satisfying work. The time of the action is 1930 and the scene of action is Kantapura, a South Indian village. Most of the inhabitants of the village are illiterate. Murthy, the central figure, being an educated and staunch Gandhi man, tries to establish the concept of Gandhian civil disobedience movement against the red man's government. He goes from door to door to explain the villagers the significance of Mahatma Gandhi's struggle for independence. The novel primarily deals with the struggle of the people of Kantapura to gain independence. Now, I'd like to move to the forward, which is the topic out of our discussion. At the right-hand side, I have put the forward, and in the left-hand side, I have tried to point out the keywords. So this is a very short forward, and I'd like to read it out once to make the things easier. So here we go. There is no village in India, however mean, that has not a rich Sthala Purana or legendary history of its own. Some god or godlike hero has passed by the village. Rama might have rested under this peepal tree. Sita might have dried her clothes after her bath on this yellow stone, or Mahatma himself on one of his many pilgrimages through the country might have slept in this hut, the low one, by the village gate. In this way, the past mingles with the present, and the gods mingle with men to make the repertory of your grandmother always bright. One such story from the contemporary annals of a village I have tried to tell. The telling hasn't been easy. One has to convey in a language that is not one's own, the spirit that is one's own. One has to convey the various shades and omission of a certain thought movement that looks maltreated in an alien language. I use the word alien, yet English is not really an alien language to us. It is the language of our intellectual makeup, like Sanskrit or Persian was before, but not of our emotional makeup. We are all instinctively bilingual. Many of us writing in our own language and in English. We cannot write like the English. We shouldn't. We cannot write only as Indians. We have grown to look at the large world as part of us. Our method of expression, therefore, has to be a dialect which will someday prove to be as distinctive and colorful as the Irish or the American. Time alone will justify it. After language, the next problem is that of style. The tempo of Indian life must be infused into our English expression. Even as the tempo of American or Irish life has gone into the making of theirs. We in India think quickly, we talk quickly, and when we move quickly. There must be something in the sun of India that makes us rush and tumble and run on. And our paths are paths interminable. The Mahabharata has 2,14,778 verses, and the Ramayana 48,000. Now, before moving to this slide, I would like to point out the keywords from this page. These are the Sthala Purana, past mingles with the present, alien language, bilingual, and tempo. I would give a analysis of these keywords later on. The Puranas are endless and innumerable. We have neither punctuation nor the treacherous adds and owns to bother us. We tell one interminable tale. Episode follows episode, and when our thoughts stop, our breath stops. And we move on to another thought. This was and still is the ordinary style of our storytelling. I have tried to follow it myself in the story. It may have been told of an evening when, as the dusk falls, and through the sudden quiet lights slip up in the house after house, and stretching her bedding on the veranda, a grandmother might have told you, newcomer, the sad tale of her village. Now, from this page, I have pointed out storytelling as a keyword. Now, moving on to the next slide, I'd like to analyze the keywords. The first comes Sthala Purana. In the foreword, Rao argues that the novel is Sthala Purana. Now, the Sthala Purana is something that literally means legendary history. According to Rao, each and every village of India has its own history, and Kantapura is not an exception. Kantapura tells the story of the village struggle for independence. Kantapura is microcosm of the macrocosm, in the sense that what happens in Kantapura was happening all over the country during those stirring days of Gandhian freedom struggle. The novel takes us to the world of Hindu history. Now, the second one is past mingles with present. Raja Rao made an effective use of myths to create the juxtaposition between past and the present. At the beginning of the story, the village's communal life is structured around a shared myth of the village's goddess, Kenchamma, who supposedly fought in a battle to protect the village. This myth keeps the glory of the village intact. Rao used the mythical technique to highlight the present through the mention of past. Next, we have alien language, which is a very important keyword. Rao said, one has to convey in a language that is not one's own, the spirit that is one's own. Well, while constructing a thought, one always uses his or her mother tongue. Some goes for creating a literary piece. One has the spirit in mother tongue, but conveying the thought in any language other than the mother tongue is quite difficult. Under the British Raj, English wasn't really an alien language. It became a part of Indian life, but it was used for the intellectual makeup, not the emotional makeup. Now, emotional makeup means something that in which language we can express our emotions, like the Sanskrit or Persians. But English is used for something for showing the intellect of people at that time. Now comes the bilingual. We are all instinctively bilingual, claimed Rao, as many of the Indians were using their own language and English for writing. The Indian writing in English wasn't completely English. It had the intrinsic flavor of Indian touch, which was different from the English dialect. Rao believed that someday, with time's justification, this Indian English dialect would be as distinctive and colorful as the Irish or the American. Next, we have tempo. Etymologically, the word tempo means rate of speed. Rao went on to say that we in India think quickly, we talk quickly, and when we move quickly. The tempo of American or Irish life made their own English expression. Similarly, the Indian tempo must be infused into our English expression. The last we have storytelling. Few of the villagers can read or write, and storytelling ceremonies are a crucial part of the village's communal life. Oral tradition is a source of power in the village as it allows its inhabitants to shape their understanding of history, consolidate their identity as a community around shared religious values, and organize politically against the repressive British government. In the novel, the story of Kantapura is told by an elder Brahmin woman, Achakka, who speaks for the village as a whole in collective we. Now, what are the problems of Indian writing in English that we got to know from the forward? I'm going to discuss it in an elaborate form. So first, I have pointed out the Indianized English, which is more of a hybrid kind of version of English with Indianness. So at first, I'd like to draw your attention to the category Indian writing in English. Do we call Indian writing in Bengali or Indian writing in Oriya? Precisely, we don't. Because Bengali, Oriya, etc., these are the mother tongues of some people in India. But English, it is not our mother tongue. One doesn't speak it from childhood. The language was introduced to us when the British government wanted a group of people knowing English to work as the clerks. So, English is a second language to the Indians. The English dialect we have in the Indian writing is not purely the British English. As Raja Rao said, we cannot write like the English. We shouldn't. We cannot write only as Indians. The authors like Raja Rao, R.K. Narayan were trying to represent the things happening in India in a language which was not the mother tongue. And while representing the social values, cultural moods of India, one just cannot stop himself from putting down the intrinsic Indianness. Therefore, what we have is more of a hybrid kind of version of Indianized English. That is why it needs to be categorized as Indian writing in English. Now, in the second, we have inability while expressing Indian thoughts in an alien language. I remember back in the high school, one of my teachers said to me that if you want to write a good piece of English, then you have to think in English and write in English. Well, most of us used to think in our mother tongue. It comes naturally, and it's quite difficult to think in a language that is not our mother tongue. Similarly, while creating a literary piece, one may face problem while expressing his thoughts in an alien language. Now we are thinking in mother tongue, thinking about the things of India, but expressing it in English. It is more of a transcreation. Sometimes we cannot exactly express what we think. One has to deduct and add things to express himself in an alien language. What we really tend to tell sometimes look maltreated in a language like English. That creates a problem. But Rao believed that the method of expression of the Indians would be a distinct dialect someday. Now, the next we have the cultural differences that sometimes prove to be a form of hindrance. And how? I'm going to discuss that. The cultural differences between these two languages also create problem. Rao in his Kantapura, giving the notion of a rural area in India, which has a Grammo Devata. I'm using the word Grammo Devata because I'm going to use the English word later on. But the British culture doesn't have a concept such as Grammo Devata. It is our concept of Grammo Devata. And therefore, there is no proper word to express it. It is because of the cultural differences. So, what is Rao doing? He is simply translating it. Grammo, he is taking the word village, and Devata, he is taking the word deity. And he is creating a word village deity. So he using the word village deity to express the idea of the Grammo Devata. Who is the Grammo Devata is the Kenchamma who supposedly fought in a battle to protect the village. Then after that, we get to know about the Harikatha. Similarly, this doesn't have a proper word in English. It is an Indian word. And it is a kind of vajan through which the people of Kantapura is united as a community. And second, we have from our culture, which is the storytelling motif. The story of the fictional village of the Kantapura is told by an elder Brahmin woman, Achakka, who tells the legendary history of Kantapura. And it is the storytelling motif that helps to unite the villagers to act against the red man's government as a team. So the English culture doesn't have this type of concepts that we have, like the Grammo Devata and the storytelling motives, etc. So the cultural gap between these two made a giving and taking of words from the Indian dictionary, as we are giving the words like Grammo Devata and translating it like village deity. So there is a problem of purity. We are having something, a Indianized version of English. Next, we have bilingualism. Many people in India are bilingual in the sense that they know both English and regional language. Similarly, we have bilingual writers who write in English and regional language. Rao himself knew three languages. Like I have mentioned earlier, he knew Kannada, French, and English, but his mother tongue was Kannada. And therefore, he translates the Kannada idioms, phrases, proverbs present in the regional vocabularies in India. For example, he is saying in the novel, "You are a traitor to your salt givers. You are a traitor to your salt givers," which is a very known phrase in India. In India, we call it Nimak Haram, and he is translating it. ভাবানুবাদ বঙ্গানুবাদ যেটা আমরা বলে থাকি সেটাই উনি করছেন, "You are a traitor to your salt givers." So here is bilingualism is working as a problem. It is proving to a translation type of work which doesn't have the purity of English. And last, we have the critical use of grammar and syntax in English sometimes disrupt the quality of the literary piece. Now, English has a very critical use of punctuation and grammar. The British government didn't want to teach the English to Indians as an academic language. Rather, they wanted people to knowing English that they would work like clerks in the office. So it was more of an official language rather than the academic language. So this leads to misuse of punctuation because we don't have the basic primary knowledge of it. And Rao said, "We have neither punctuation nor the treacherous adds and ons to bother us." So it bothers us because we don't know the proper use of it. It bothers us when we are going to use the preposition, "Oh, what should I put? Am I going to add or on?" So this is a confusion that is made by this grammar. So lastly, I want to quote a few lines from Kamala Das. She wrote very beautifully, "The language I speak becomes mine. Its distortions, its queerness, all mine. Mine alone. It is half English, half Indian, funny perhaps, but it is honest. It is as human as I am human." So in spite of these problems, we are still reading our Indian writing in English, and thus the legacy continues. Thank you.
Thank you, Shiny. That was Shantika, right? Sorry.
Yes,
Yeah.
Shantika.
Shantika. That was wonderfully done. I am applauding the kind of effort that you have put in and the depth and thoroughness through which you have really presented. I'm getting absolutely jittery. এরপরে তো তোমাদেরকে এখানে এনে বসিয়ে দিতে হবে তোমাকে, সমীরণকে। The kind of work that as first year students you have done is commendable, wonderful. Like with Shomiron, you will also get a small prize from me when the classes reopen. Just remind me, right? But thank you, Mane. I hope your classmates have listened to this very carefully, because Shantika has not only, just dissected the preface, the preface to the foreword to the novel, but she's also sort of brought in some very interesting points here. She's talked about bilingualism, she's talked about cultural differences, and so on and so forth. Now, I especially like the way in which Shantika ended with that quote from Kamala Das. And what Kamala Das was fundamentally arguing there is that, we don't need to write English like Englishmen, right? Because we don't speak like them. And the other thing is that, this concept of bilingualism, which I'll discuss a little later on, but what I do now is try and fold up a few things that Shantika has pointed out and give you a certain kind of a contextualization, because you see, what Shantika has very, very brilliantly done is brought about the problems, but I'd like to just put it into a larger historical context. So I will present my segment now, and I'll go back to that preface once again and point out a few things, so that you get a sense of what Shantika was trying also to make. Now, I have quite a number of texts today for you. One is, of course, the foreword to Raja Rao's Kantapura. Now, remember that in the development of Indian writing in English, there are different stages, right? So, if that's the first, with Dirozio, Hindu College, and the Indians learning English, there's a first phase. Most of the Indians are traveling overseas, they're coming back with the English knowledge, and they're trying to write in English, right? But they're heavily influenced by the Byronic, by the Miltonic kind of English. Therefore, many of these English texts, especially poetry, is largely, divorced, I would say, separated from the Indian way of speaking. So you have the early phase where you have Dirozio, you have, say, Michael Madhusudhan Dutta, all of them writing in an English which is largely dated, archaic, and so on and so forth. Now then, gradually English starts to enter into our curriculum, our existences, but be very careful about this here. And this is one of the great arguments against Indian writing in English, is that to whom is English available? Is still English available to all and sundry? Or is still the study of English largely restricted to a certain class of people, middle class, upper middle class? You see, I have no idea where all of you come from, but I can guess that a large number of you are part of English medium schools and Bengali medium schools, where English is something which you've had to put in an effort to study, right? So the late 19th century, we see people who are going to England, studying there and writing, but very interestingly, writing both in English and in Bengali. Now, a great example of this would be Rishi Aurobindo, for example, or for that matter, Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, or for that matter, very importantly, Rabindranath. You see, Rabindranath does not write in English. There are only very few prose and poems and plays that is written in English. He decides to translate Gitanjali, a song offerings which is published in 1912 when he's ill and he cannot write anything in Bengali. So to pass the while, he starts translating his poems into English. Therefore, even for Rabindranath, English is not the way in which he thinks or he wants to write. It's just that he's bilingual, he knows both of them. But who is bilingual? You see, even today, if you go to the villages, the remote population is not bilingual, right? Thanks to TV, they might speak some words of English or they might speak some Hindi, but more or less they are part of one language only. They can understand Hindi maybe. But English, most of the people can't. So bilingual is the people who have been exposed to education, very importantly, and who have a certain class structure. So our first question is, when Raja Rao talks about, our essential bilingualism, what class is he referring to? Who is the reader of Indian fiction in English? It's the reader who knows his English and who is bilingual, but who belongs to a certain class privilege, right? So the problem with Indian writing in English is that it is available to only a certain segment of the population which has a definite class bias, right? So this is the problem of readership. Now, if we come to Raja Rao now, and this is the foreword, which Shanti very brilliantly analyzed, Shantika rather, right? Raja Rao is making, this is the point, this is the line which is probably the one which you should take down and which you should quote. One has to convey, this is the line. In a language that is not one's own, the spirit that is one's own, right? And Raja Rao is pointing out something which is fundamentally true even now. We do not think in English, right? Even though we may speak in English, when it comes to thought processes, emotional feelings, we essentially feel in our mother tongue, and that is very, very infrequently English. Therefore, the problem for the Indian writer in English is to convey in a language that is not one's own, the spirit that is one's own. I like what Shantika was doing with the word namak haram. Namak haram is mixed with a lot of vengeance, anger, detestation. Namak haram, beiman, jokhon tumi bolcho, you are bringing in a lot of vehemence to whatever you're saying. Now, somebody who has not repaid one's own salt is a horrible word on the one hand, right? Is a horrible way of expression. But more than that, it takes away the vengeance. It takes away the inflection of the language, takes away the emotion and the spirit. That is the problem with the Indian writer. How does one convey precisely the emotions which one wants to convey in a language that is not one's own, right? So this is the other problem, the attempt to, as it were, translate one's own process or one's own thought and emotions, right? So even then, if English is not really an alien language to us, how many of you actually can think in English? Very few of you can, right? So our deepest emotions, our deepest moments of fear are all expressed in a language that is not one's own. Therefore, the English writer has to create a kind of emotion, inflection in language that can express precisely one's own concerns. See, take this matter for Obiman, for example. How does one translate Obiman into English? You see, Rabindranath's words, for example, when he's translating the Gitanjali poems, uses a deliberate biblical English. to give that kind of a different spiritual flavor to those poems. But again, when you read those poems, there are some poems of the Gitanjali where the Bangla is much more earthy, Matir Bhasha, which takes away a large part of the effect of what Rabindranath is trying to compose. Right. Then comes, as Shantika was pointed out, the concept of style. So, every language has its proverbs, for example. Every language has its own colloquialisms. Every language has its own tempo. How does one convey that tempo in another language? Right? The Scots have a different English. The Irish have a different way of speaking. The Indians have a different way of speaking. Right? So this question of style, very importantly also, is Indian English a different language? Now, this is a question which was asked by Salman Rushdie in 1981 rather, when one of the most important texts of Indian English was published, and that was Midnight's Children. If you look at Midnight's Children, you will find that Rushdie is using an English which is saturated and frequently punctuated with Indian words. Now, Rushdie referred to this hybridization of language. I like the way in which Shantika used the word hybridization. The hybridization of language, the coexistence of the Indian, the Urdu, the Hindi words. For example, the slang that is used in the colloquial word. So very often, and Rushdie has an article in The Guardian. If you want to read it, I'll send it to you. It's exactly 40 years since Midnight's Children has been published, and Midnight's Children is a landmark in Indian writing in English. If you are interested, please do read up Midnight's Children. You will not get this time any longer. So you have this time. It's a difficult book. But Rushdie says that he took the influence from a Jewish writer who was using certain Jewish concepts into an English novel. And Rushdie was following that. Rushdie, therefore, suggests that the Indian writer can bring in a new English altogether, can transform the language. So everything does not need to be, translated into chaste English. If there is namak haram, then namak haram must be used as a word, and around it, its inflection or its meaning can be conveyed. Rushdie calls this the chutnification of the language. Now, all of you, are great, fans of chutney. Chutney is spicing, right? It's spicy. Chutney is spicy, right? So Rushdie is spicing up the language. He's hybridizing it. He is, as it were, kind of creating a kind of mixed language that is becoming then a proper way in which the Indian individual speaks. So when you are speaking in, say, with your friend, you're using Bangla, and you're punctuating it with some Hindi, some English. Even when you are using English, you are using it in a certain different way. Now, I'll give you an example. One of my friends who is in the Reserve Bank of India, today I was coming to my office, and then he told me, "You're going to office today, no?" Now, no Englishman would speak in this way. He would say, "Are you going to office today?" But what did he say? "You're going to office today, no?" So what is he doing? He's sort of translating the Bengali inflection. You're going to office, no? So that's a particular brand or a kind of English that the Indian is using. And Rushdie is translating that into his novel. Therefore, his entire Salman Rushdie's Midnight Children is filled with Bombaya that brings in, Hindi, that brings in Urdu, that brings in English. And therefore, what the Indian writer therefore has subsequently done is he has brought in a new kind of a language, right? So that's one problem that the Indian writer in English is talking about. Now, the other thing that there are certain problems here, which I'll bring through. This is Salman Rushdie, who's edited one of the anthologies of Indian writing in English, and is trying to defend Indian writing in English. I'll send this to you. And he says, and Rushdie makes a very important point or rather very debatable point. He says that post 1950, all the great work that has been published in Indian literature has not been in the vernacular, but it has been in English, right? And therefore, this is a point to debate. Now, many of the detractors of Rushdie have pointed out that, and he acknowledges that Indian writing will never be more than a post-colonial anomaly, the bastard child of empire, sired on India by the departing British, its continuing use of the old colonial tongue. Many of them have vehemently protested against Rushdie, saying that all good literature is produced only by Indian writing in English, Indian writers in English. And he says that Indian writers in English are truly cosmopolitan in the sense that they have opened up the windows of the world to India and India to the world. So Indian writing in English is now the true index and placing India in world literature. So you see Indians winning Booker Prizes and maybe, who knows, later on a Nobel Prize. And he says that even Rabindranath was winning the Nobel Prize because he was translated into English and so on and so forth. But he suggests that over the last 20 years, and Rushdie is writing it in 2000, he says that it is Indian writing in English which is more important than the vernacular languages. But just think about, say, something like Shotinath Bhaduri's Dorai Chorit Manush, which talks about the subaltern experience. Can any Indian writing in English really bring that kind of fiction alive, that kind of pain, anxiety, angst alive? And has any real Indian writer tried to express that in the English language? You see, think about Dalit literature. Dalit literature has been translated, but it has, the pain, the empathy has largely been in the mother tongue. So also, there are very few authors who've actually tried to go down to the basics and try to reflect their lives in Indian writing in English. Think of Amitav Ghosh, for example, The Hungry Tide, or Gun Island more recently. Ghosh is the only person who's really tried to convey this kind of subaltern existence into Indian fiction using the Indian sensibilities. For example, he takes up the Bon Bibi Pala and translates this into English. But even then, that sounds a little artificial, right? The directness, the immediacy of the language that is used in Bangla or say Marathi or say Hindi is markedly absent in Indian writing in English. So this conveyance of the emotion and the social reality is something that has probably eluded Indian writing in English. And therefore, what has been its subject matter? Its subject matter, its protagonist, has largely been middle class or upper middle class realities. For example, take R.K. Narayan, for example. And R.K. Narayan is taking this, provincial life of Malgudi. But again, most of the characters do belong, and the kind of expression of English is largely middle class. Mulk Raj Anand, for example, tries this in Coolie. But once again, he follows the Dickensian English rather than a definitive Indian writing in English. And that is why I asked you to read Raja Rao, because Raja Rao is the one who tries to bring in the Indianness of the English into Indian writing in English. So those that I'm sure you will be picking up on while you study your texts, right? And you see, Rushdie is saying that the ironical proposition is that India's best writing since independence may have been done in the language of the departed imperialists, right? And he argues, for example, that it is more experimental and it is projecting a kind of cosmopolitanism, and it is uniting India, as it were. So it has a pan-Indian appeal, whether vernacular languages are largely parochial, right? Now, these are issues debates which our Rushdie is generating. I'll send this, and so that you can, read this also. But I've also taken up something which Alexis Stadi, who works with the French Asiatic Society, as it were, sort of raises in one of his introductions to Indian writing in English. And, he also refers to Rushdie and suggests that Indian writing in English has a very quaint appeal for an overseas market. Now, how much Indian writing in English is really read by Indians at large, apart from the university intelligentsia, right? So, in a way, once there is a prize to a particular book, The God of Small Things, for example, it is then that comes into the syllabus and all of us start reading it. So, you have to think of the publishing industry and the way in which Indian writing in English has been promoted by the publishing industry as something which can appeal and have a market in terms of a pan-Indian market, right? So this is one point that has to be made. And also remember that very often Indian writing in English is mostly urban. Of course, there are exceptions. But by and large, it talks about urban India more than it talks about rural India. The other thing is that very often, and since Shantika mentioned the Sthala Purana, many of the Indian fictions have actually gone back to the myths. Think about the great Indian novel in English, or for that matter, think about something like Chitra Banerjee Divakaruni's The Palace of Illusions, which goes back to the Mahabharata, right? So many of these Indian fictions in English have actually gone back to the older myths and tried to reinterpret it. That has been one aspect. And also, in a certain sense, as Aijaz Ahmed once pointed out, that Indian writing in English has been, in some ways, narrating the problematics of the Indian nation post-independence. That India has always been divided into two Indias. One which has had access to education, which has had access to privileges, which has had access to government subsidies. And that is the educated Bhadralok intelligentsia. It's percolated down to a certain extent to the other parts of the population as well. But there's always been one India which has been segregated, isolated and marginalized. And that marginalized India, including the Dalits, including the Adivasis, including the very poor, have never had access to English. The Indian writing in English has always been partial and has represented only a certain fragmented part of the population. So, In a certain sense, Indian writing in English has narrated only part of the nation. Now, there is also another kind of Indian writing in English which you are looking at and which you will be studying in your syllabus also, is the writings of the Indian diaspora, right? Diaspora meaning, the spores which have spread to other parts. So a diaspora is a certain population of a country moving to the other territories, as it were, beyond the nation. The most important such diaspora, of course, is the Jewish diaspora, because the Jewish were displaced from their places and moved all across the world, and then came back to Jerusalem and so on and so forth. But there's been a very powerful Indian diaspora as well. And this Indian diaspora has moved to many places, but more importantly to the West, right? So a lot of Indians settled down in Britain, in US, and Indian writing in English, there is this theme that it has catered to their existence, right? So when Jhumpa Lahiri is writing The Interpreter of Melodies, for example, he's talking about these diasporic individuals. First generation diasporas and their struggles, second generation diasporas and their problems of identity. Are they Indian? Are they British? Or are they American? And it is very often argued that Indian writing in English, the bulk of the Indian writing in English is directed towards these diasporic populations. Therefore, in certain senses, that argument that Raja Rao made about Indian writing being considered alien is a valid argument, in the sense that there are many Indias. You need to understand this. There's not one India. One India is a very attractive term to believe in, but there are many Indias. And Indian writing in English traditionally has belonged to certain Indias. And when Salman Rushdie says that all vernacular literature post-independence has been superseded by Indian writing in English, he's only being partially true. Indian writing in English might have carved an international niche, might have talked about the diaspora and their existences, might have appealed to the upper middle class audiences. But there exists beyond the pale of this Indian writing in English a vast segment of the population which has thought in the vernacular, written in the vernacular, read in the vernacular. And therefore, you have a category of literatures which has come up as Bhasha literatures. And they have been accessible to the people at large only through translation. And translation from one Indian language to another, or from one Indian language into English. Right? So let me round up this discussion, because we've been talking for quite some time now. What are the problems of Indian writing in English? Or what are the issues of Indian writing in English? The first is the issue of class, readership, characterization. What has been the class nature of Indian writing in English? It is intimately associated with English as such. Although English is a national language, it is accessible to only a certain segment of the population, and it is only this segment of the people for whom the literature has been written and read in India. And therefore, its characters, its settings are urban, and primarily a large segment of the population has been left out. This is my first point. The second point is, how have Indian writers sort of reacted or tried to create a new idiom for the Indian writing in English? And that has dealt with the ways in which our narrative forms of the Puranas, Ramayanas, Mahabharatas, and our own language, the coexistence of the Hindi and the English, Bangla and the English, for example, have created a form, a hybridity of form and language, which Rushdie refers to as the chutnification of language. But very often, you see, we've used our own forms also. We've just not imitated the classical realist British form, but say, for example, Raja Rao, for example, in the Kantapura is using the oral technique, the form of the Purana, as it were, to communicate his narration. So, experimentation with form and technique. And thirdly, what I see is a literature about the Indian diaspora, who moved out, their questions of identity, belonging, alienation. These have been important ways in which Indian writing in English has tried to cater to a different set of Indians, as it were. Fourthly, I would like to suggest that Indian writing in English has now moved beyond trying to be the colonizer's language to emerge into its own formal and linguistic identity, where it is no longer ashamed to announce its Indianness, where it's no longer fearful to translate every concept, but rather attempts to engage the global reader on its own terms. Now, Rushdie is probably right when he says that Indian writing has created a cosmopolitan window through which Indian literature is now part of a global literature. But the problem here is that it only projects a certain India. Its themes are restricted. Its locations are restricted. Its class is restricted. And until and unless this expands phenomenally, it's very difficult to say that this is a true representative of the Indianness. Rather, you see, it is very important for us to understand that Indian writing or Indian literature as a category must include literatures written in our mother tongues, its translations into English and other Indian languages, and Indian writing in English simultaneously. It is only within this broad corpus that we can have a sense of what is Indian literature. But Indian literature in English, therefore, is a product of the empire. It articulates the problems of our sense of belonging, our struggle with language, our problems of hybridity, bilingualism, cultural translation. And therefore, it is in this fascinating mix that you can contextualize Indian writing in English, and you must place it in a history which starts off with the late 18th century and slowly evolves with globalization, with independence, then with globalization, and finally when we enter into an age of late capitalism. So it's not one category. It's something which has mutated, which has changed with history, and always needs to be, treated or read along with history. But remember Raja Rao, and that's why I once again go back to that foreword again and again. go back to that one phrase that he used. One has to convey in a language that is not one's own the spirit that is one's own. That has still remained the central problematic of Indian writing in English. It is with that then, therefore, that I'm bringing this, discussion to a close. What I've done with you in two different classes is that I've given you a history of Indian writing in English, and I've raised certain problems and theoretical issues that Indian writing in English should provoke within you. Now, you have a definite coordinator for this paper. You have distinct teachers who are going to also probably discuss these issues with you. It's only that I thought pertinent that before I launch into Derozio, I have a very small component with you, 2 poems. And I'll probably take 2 more classes to discuss these 2 poems. I ought to alert you to the broader parameters through which you can read the rest of the texts. I'll stop the recording here, and if you have any questions, I'll take them now.